east and west?
No. It's different there. I was just wondering, since you were a professional philosopher and you were through the experience, from that point of view, what would you have to tell us that perhaps somebody that wasn't into philosophy wouldn't?
I guess you'll have to tell me what professional philosophy is. I sort of backed into philosophy. Mm-hmm. I specialized in philosophy for sure. Mainly, I started out pre-med, took a bunch of physiology courses, made good grades, but I didn't want to cut frogs all my life. Right?
Yeah.
Or people, right? Mm-hmm. Decided that I was pretty good with a scalpel, but I really didn't want to cut people the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. And so forth and so on. I backed out of about 6 majors while I was in college. The amazing thing to me is that today you're expected to know what you want to do the moment you hit the door. And I regard that as absolute stupidity. College is a time where you should roam around and make mistakes and find out that you don't want to do that. Don't want to do that. I didn't want to be I thought I'd like sociology for a while. I wound up deciding that group work was a very slow way of changing people's minds. And so I backed out of sociology. I thought psychology would be good, but I found out psychologists don't read anything. They just chase rats. And I wish this were not true today. You know, this is 40 years ago, right? 45 years ago. But then I found out they did nothing but chase rats. So I backed out of psychology, went to theology. I stayed in that for quite some time, but then finally decided that there are certain questions that were no-nos in theology. You just raise certain questions. You said yes to everything and didn't raise certain questions. So I decided that what I needed was a philosophy degree. And I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just went and did it. And when I was enjoying myself, they graduated me. That's what happened. Then you look around the country and say, I was in New York at the time, right? And said, what on earth do I do with this strange degree from Columbia, rather? And lo and behold, a friend of mine rescued me. He said he'd looked through 300 applications and couldn't decide on paper who he wanted, so he telephoned me. And I never even looked for a job. I don't even know what that's about. There's a kid staying with us right now who's looking for a job. And he asks me, what do you do? And I said, 50 years, 60 years, I've never looked for a job in my life. And so my guess, your guess is as good as mine. So that's how I wound up teaching philosophy. And I think there's a certain justice to it, namely, you really ought to study the subject matter you're interested in and not worry about what you're going to be doing in 40 years. Because I understand they tell us that almost everybody makes at least 3 major vocational changes in their life. And so I just happened to make them before I started working. That's about all I can say. Whether the ethnic thing makes a difference, you might raise that question. And I suppose, I don't know how, I suppose you want me to be pretty candid. You want me to be honest?
Yeah, that'd be nice.
There were certain, it was pretty obvious to me that nobody's going to hire me as Japanese during the war doing anything, including the church. But the church was my last choice. The first choice was, that was the sentiment at the time. So I suppose I stayed in school largely as an escape, which you probably won't do because you're gung-ho for a job, which I regard as really a little perverse. But that's maybe one thing that one can say is that I have said this in the past. Racist American society saved me from confusing a lot of people that I might have confused for friends. That's a little mean, but it's true. A lot of people will check out as your potential friends just because you are different. I don't know how different I am, but if you look at me and think American, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether you do that. I should ask you. I say, if you look at me and think American, oh, he's an American. You're not a racist. But if you don't, you are. How's that? Because I think you ought to run that test by your friends once in a while. It ought to cheer you up. No, it ought to depress you about American society. But that was perfectly clear when I was growing up. That there are a lot of jobs you simply could not have. That's obvious, isn't it? And I'm not saying anything new. It's true today.
I was going to say, I think it's true for a lot of us, socioeconomic backgrounds, no matter, that alone.
Yeah. Do you find it strange that I run around driving a Chevette instead of a Honda? I think it's rather cute myself, but I can't afford a Honda. I drive a Chevette, right? No, actually, I drive my '76 Valiant, which is a second-hand car. It's a pretty good car, but it's cheap. Now, you expect a guy who looks like me and who tries to look like a Japanese businessman. I wear a tie clasp because I'm cold and my neck's cold, right? And this way you get 12 layers of cloth between your neck and the world, right? And so they ask you, how come you wear a tie to class every day? I say, so you'll confuse me for a Japanese businessman. That's one of my answers. I'm not sure I'm giving you much of an answer, but certainly the vocational choice as a technical philosopher may have been influenced by the ethnic consideration, in a way.
Mm-hmm. In reflection on that?
Yeah. Namely, that it forced me to keep my eye on my business. I mean, studies where I wanted to study, rather than thinking that I could make a big economic success running electronics company in New York City or something. Well, I've been mean enough already. Two very mean comments. Do you have any reflection? What's your response to those? Rathke? Rathke?
No, I'm curious.
How do you say it?
That's Ratchy.
Rathke.
I think in your videotape that we saw, you talked about how the churches responded somewhat. And
I was talking about my father largely.
yeah,
I left all these cynical comments out.
what was their role in did it change during the course of that time?
I would say that the church is a very large institution, and the churches that did help, you could count on there.
Throughout,
But that was a very, actually, I mean, percentage-wise, it wasn't a large percentage of the church. I'd say that. But the churches, the people I mentioned were largely churchmen because they knew my dad professionally. And they'd known him for 50 years, so 20 years, and they lived to relate. But, and so they were automatically on my side. And there are some churches that were informed of the situation. And would look at people and know they're not, Japanese. What do you think of my isnt test? I just thought of that on my way over there. I said, well, if they really want an isnt test about racism, they should look at me and say, do you think American when you see me? And if you do, you're not racist, and if you don't, you are. And so's your old man, right? Did I answer your question? I think a lot of the churches were sensitive to the situation. I'd say on the whole, there were very liberal churches. I mean, liberal with regard to racism. I think it's pretty clear to me that the Quakers, the Methodists, some Presbyterians would probably at the forefront of that. But that's about it.
how about before? I mean, was it were like other churches? Did they turn their backs then at this time, or?
No, I think that I suppose you would say the normal church is pretty insensitive anyway. I mean, on the whole, they are too worried about their own thing, right? Worried about getting a congregation. After all, when you step into the social scene, like the evacuation scene or something like that, it's a pretty major step. And on the whole, churches are conservative. But there are, of course, liberal elements involved. In certain churches make a point of it. And those churches you could count.
I'd be interested to know how church going or how Christian or how religious the key decision makers were at that time when they were deciding to intern all these American citizens and their parents. I'd be interested to know how they would view something as, and that's, are you a Christian? And if they say, well, yes, I say, well, why are you doing it?
If you're asking about people who made the decisions, like
Simpson, McCoy, people like
President Roosevelt,
yeah.
Chief Justice Warren, great liberal Walter Lippmann. Are you asking about their religion?
I'm asking, well,
God only knows, and I suppose he's not going to tell. I don't. Roosevelt was a sometime Anglican, right? He was Episcopalian. And I don't know, he probably went to church about like Episcopalians go to church. Namely, they love the art forms. that a bit cynical? Well, most people go to church for certain reasons. And usually because their mothers or fathers went, on the whole. That's the general rule. I don't delude myself anymore, thinking that there are, real reasons for going to church. Most people go to church because their moms and dads do. And then a good number maybe decide mommy and daddy were wrong, and then they make their own churches. And they fell in love with a Unitarian, and so they went to the Unitarian Society or something like that. Do I have a corrupt view of human nature? It's not really corrupt. You just really ought to. I mean, I think Roosevelt had too much to worry about with regard to wars and things like that, to worry about the minor distinctions in life. You had a question?
Yeah, what do you think has to be done as far as the redress to occur? What do you think the chances are of getting what the Japanese Americans really want from the government right now?
I'm very silly about that subject. You've talked to my brother-in-law, brother-in-law and sister-in-law, I understand. And one of them is for it and one of them is against it. And I tend to think that perhaps anything the JACL does is probably, this goes back 45 years, anything the Japanese American Citizens League does, including the segregation of the Japanese military force and so forth, and the Japanese American military force, is probably a half a loaf. I mean, it usually is a halfway measure. And if you really want to rectify it, you need the whole loaf. And so I've usually disagreed with them because I think the whole ballgame is better than the half ballgame, right? And so as a compromise solution, I suppose it might make some sense, but as a real solution, I think it's perfectly obvious that people make mistakes, and I don't think that we have to. I don't think money's not the matter. It's, as far as I'm concerned, it's the principle of the thing, and just so long as we don't make any principle mistakes in principle, I don't really care how that comes out. And I realize have you talked to Sam Honda?
Just the video.
He's real hot on the subject, and I never get that hot on any subject, unless it's wine, women, and song. Maybe. But none of it. But I'm not terribly worried about that one way or the other. Most of the people who really suffered are dead. Kind of gilding, throwing a lot of money at a problem that's kind of dead. Of course, in respect of history, I guess you might say, we owe some things to history, but I mean, historians are those kind of people who remember all our mistakes. I don't know, I haven't discussed that with Khin, who is a historian, but historians sort of remember everybody's mistakes, right? And I get a little sick of that.
How would you respond, though, to the person that would reply that you are correct that it is half a loaf, but it would serve as kind of a safeguard to prevent something like the same doesn't happen in the future?
Sometimes something is worse than nothing, and I think you have to be very careful about when those decisions occur. I mean, I certainly wouldn't think that I guess the way they reason is that if if the American taxpayer had to pay some money for all this historical mistake, then everybody would be aware of what that's going to do. I tend to think American taxpayers just worried about paying his taxes. And as he says, we just didn't pay our taxes. So now we're going to pay them. And it's rather silly to pay them for that, and so forth and so on. Sometimes, after all, I suppose if we wanted to do this theologically, you want to do it theologically. Say, there's only, I should ask you, how do you overcome guilt in theology?
Oh, wow.
Penance?
Big question. It only happens to be the only reason for doing theology. But how do you overcome the guilt and responsibility and so forth?
Getting it out in the open, talking about it, not trying to cover it up, not trying to hide it.
Was all
Trying.
that mean?
Yeah.
Well,
Trying to look at it objectively, if that's possible.
is this confession?
Sort of, yeah.
How high, I'm guessing, are you a Lutheran?
No, I'm an Anglican.
An Anglican. That's even better. What does an Anglican do when he really knows he's wrong?
He says I was wrong. He kicks himself in the head. And, at least if he's a good
Oh, well, a
Anglican.
good high church Anglican will go to confession.
No, confession? No.
They don't do that?
No, I've never come across it, no.
You don't confess? You don't confess?
Well, we confess, but we don't go to Little Beef and knock on the door.
Well, that depends on how
Okay,
high.
right.
You're a
Yeah.
latitudinarian. Broad church.
I try to be.
You're not a smells and bells Anglican.
Oh, no, I'm not. No.
Right. So you do it in public, right?
Sure.
You just say,
I did this wrong, and try very hard to realize why it was wrong and try to take steps to see I don't do it again, you know.
so it's public confession.
Sure.
Right? It's
Yeah.
public repentance. And then what happens?
What happens then? Well, I realize everyone knows that you made a big mistake. You can't hide it.
Well, I want you as a good theologian to drag God back into it. So,
God, I have
what
sinned.
happens?
I've sinned. Give me a break.
Do you feel okay? Religion's a matter of feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, well,
I
absolutely.
mean, some.
Yeah, if I've sinned and I made a big mistake, I usually feel a lot better and knowing I've got the guts to talk about it.
Okay,
See?
then what happens is it possible to feel at one with deity, at one with God, if you haven't made a public?
If you haven't made in my opinion, no. In my opinion, no.
So when does, I wonder, just asking a very practical question, when does healing take place? Or what do you expect?
When you, I even in circles now, when you grow, when you come to a certain realization that you've made a mistake and sort of pat yourself in the back. Well, here I'm able to say I've made a mistake and I'm able
That's pretty well true throughout the religious tradition. I mean, most of it. Even Lutherans would answer it the same way, wouldn't they? Wouldn't he be roughly in the Christian ballpark?
Yeah, boy.
What's the rest of the way?
Well, collective repentance in that I person can also, it's easy to the conscience. I think he can also grow from inside himself as well as outside. That's all I'm saying.
Well, what would make you feel that you're back in God's good graces?
What would I have to do to achieve that?
in society's good graces or whatever it is. I'm asking, when does health return? How do you know that you're healthy again?
What healthy, spiritually talking about.
I don't care.
I know, right?
Because, see, I'm taking it from the spiritual and going right to the socio-political. That's what we're talking about.
Right.
How do we know we're politically healthy again? That's exactly what but I was running off the Christian analogy,
Right.
the theological analogy, it seems to me.
Well, I would think it'd have to come from the inside. You know what I'm saying? If you feel good inside, if your conscience are eased, and then if you want to work outside of you collectively with other people. Follow me?
Well,
Maybe.
I was wondering where the one ends and the other begins. You're criticizing his view because...
No, I'm not criticizing him. I'm just saying
You're saying he's half right, which is saying he's half wrong. You're saying he's half true. Half true means he's a liar, right?
I wasn't calling him a liar. I just kind of disagreed with his comment, but no biggie. I don't want to cause a ruckus.
No, I'm causing the fight, right? But you did say he was wrong.
Yeah, all of a sudden, what'd you say again? I even lost
I forgot. No. But the basic point is that the key way for me in
All I want to know, really, is we can forget all the byplay and my name calling. I called you a liar. No, I said you. I called him a liar. All I really want to know is, how do you heal social sickness?
What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, I think that if we're talking about race, or we're talking about war, or any socio-pathological problems, you really have to know what you mean when everything's okay again. And that's where I started from. How do you know when you're sick, and how do you know when you're healthy? That's the question. And then, what are you going to do with? I mean, it's conceivable to me. You can pass all the laws you want to, and tax yourself to death, paying for it. All the problems, you throw money at every problem you want to, but when are you going to be considered healthy? When do you go back to living the good life? I don't know. I'm asking. And Carmela. My vision is really awful, but even with glasses. Actually, I'm responding to your question, right? Your question is, do I believe in the redress? And my question back is, how do we know when we've overcome a problem? And how do we know when we're healthy? And is a few American bucks going to solve it? I realize Congress would probably throw some money at it, and Ronnie would send the Marines.
See, I think there are some people too that feel strongly the other way.
Ronnie Reagan, that is.
You know, I can see there's
Money would solve it for them. I think that's Sam Honda's view. But just to prove that all Japanese Americans do not agree, I think that's kind of a trivial matter.
Yeah. I think there are people though that feel, for whatever reason, that there should be some type of compensation in some way towards those people. There are others that feel your way, I'm assuming, but I think there's also other people that feel strongly.
Well, the problem really is, it's a very big problem to me. It's because it's in the context of an entire healthy society. With I think with Sam and with the JCL, they tend to think in short political terms. I support the JCL. I buy their magazine. I send my yearly dues and so forth. I do all that, but basically they're very short-sighted. They would say, well, he's a philosopher and he's got his head on cloud 9, right? Because philosophers' feet don't touch the ground, right? But I think the really big problem is what would make America healthy. That's the big problem. And I wish they'd attack that one with the vigor they attack a few dollars to a lot of dead people or their heirs.
Maybe this was one way for them to bring it out in the open because it was never really discussed constitutionally.
Well, it's always been discussed.
It seems strange then that hardly.
Anybody
I'm
knows
doing
about it.
a study on that for my extra project. And it seems funny that none of the history courses, or a majority of the history courses from the high school didn't seem to include it. It just happened to be something that I recently heard about here at school, just before I enrolled.
Well, that's probably true, but that's because doesn't that say more about human beings that we tend to concentrate on our own histories and our own private worlds? It's pretty rare that you run into Professor Jensen's in the world. That's all. I believe Henry Ford's famous statement is that history is bunk, and most Americans think that that's true, including most of the students at Hamline. I see I'm reserving it to Ham. So I think that may be a human problem, not just an American problem. By the way, once you get sensitized, what do you do with it? I mean, once you find out that a lot of human beings have suffered, not just Japanese Americans, but a lot of people. Once you find out they've suffered, that's why I went immediately to my Anglican theologian over here. Once a person has suffered, and once you know he's suffered, what do you do about it? Throw money at it? Pass a bill in Congress? What? Set up an anti-discrimination committee? A civil rights commission that can be stacked with Reaganites and rule the other way? What do you do with it? All of the above?
What's your suggestion? Yeah. Leave it?
Well, you see, I'm a very perverse fellow, as Spalding knows. That the locus of moral decision is here, and in Carmela's head. Right? That's the locus of moral decision. And so, I suppose I should answer Doug a little more directly. The reason why I wound up doing philosophy is after a large consideration of how do I change another person's mind about anything, not just, racism, anything. How does one change another person's mind? And the only way in which you change a person's mind is by talking. One-on-one, by the way. Isn't it? Now that's a large decision that you can make on your own. I don't want to preclude your making. But it strikes me as the only way I can find out whether you and I agree on anything is by talking to you one-on-one. And even then, we may find agreement very difficult. And it only, near as I can tell, you have to get into a college course which will grab you some way, cause a little blood in the eye, and if it doesn't, if you can go through college like I did, getting turned, I shouldn't say this too much, getting turned off at almost, I did the work, don't worry, I never missed a day of class, and I did the work, and I wrote all the papers. I don't believe I ever turned in a paper late, but I don't know whether I got grabbed either. And I only got grabbed after I graduated. I said, gee, here I am. I'm graduated and I don't know anything. What happened? Right? So that's another reason I stayed in school, I suppose. I should have asked you, how do you change another person's life? Well, there's any other questions? I guess I keep turning your questions into questions, don't I? Which is sort of nice, because actually I think most of the questions are probably very hard. And they're questions that are worth everybody's discussing. I've made very cynical comments about waspish American society. Did you come back at me? Let's see. Jeff, what's on your mind?
Not a lot.
Besides, what's for lunch?
That's on my mind.
Well,
I have a cynical question for
Good.
you, Bill. And it is kind of philosophical, though, but suppose the average citizen responds that, well, the internment of American Japanese was wrong by the country, but that considering the huge deficits, which are now in like $200 billion a year, besides the $1 trillion deficit, and that redress would add billions on top of that, that as good Japanese, perhaps, or Americans of Japanese ancestry, that the whole nation is going to have to make sacrifices to bring this down, that they shouldn't give up that idea. How would you respond, or how do you think the Japanese American community would respond to such reasoning?
How would the Japanese American community
Respond to the JACL.
Yeah. You know, the Japanese American community in the country is very small. In Minnesota, there are about 3,000 people of Japanese ancestry. That's 1/10 of 1%? Maybe less than that. Anyway, how would they respond
To such an argument.
to such an argument? I would say right now, as far as our priorities are concerned, personally, I can only answer for myself. Personally, it would cheer me up much more if we got Reagan out of the White House. And if you paid me, my family, my wife, who was interned, if you paid her all this money, I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. And I think she'd probably turn it back into the government. I mean, if I know my wife, and it isn't clear that I do, and after 34 years of marriage, I mean, I wouldn't hazard a guess, but I would predict, I would stake my reputation as a prophet on the fact that she'd probably turn it back.
So you're saying that money won't heal it?
Right. I mean, done is done, but it's there is such a thing as forgive and forget. Now that you raise your hand, that's my bottom line. There is such a thing as forgiveness. And forgiveness only occurs after repentance.
I keep asking myself, watch the news, I read the newspapers, the magazines, and I ask myself,
I don't.
why do people hate all the time, what makes people hate somebody else, Is it selfishness, or is it fear? Both?
No, sometimes people hate each other because they've got perfectly good reasons.
Well, yeah, they're obviously, yes, but why?
Has that ever occurred to you?
Well, sure, if someone, beats up us, you're going to hate that person, but what makes people deliberately do something to someone that they didn't do anything to them? That's what I'm asking. I don't know, I wonder if anyone knows.
I don't have any final solutions, but why do people, I don't have any objection to people hating. Hating people is perfectly in order in certain situations. That's what I wanted to say. And as much immoral activity, I don't mean by immoral sexual. As much as unethical activity occurs, there's perfectly good grounds for people hating one another. The problem is, you don't want to get stuck in that, that's all. You certainly, it's certainly warranted under plenty of certain situations for us to hate others. But I do think it doesn't, you ought to, hatred ought to be confined to the same thing that we just did with ethical mistakes. Namely, when ethical mistakes occur, what is in order? Confession, forgiveness has to occur. Otherwise, or their secular equivalents, right? And otherwise, you cannot go on with your life. It seems to me restoration to social health, that's what Carmela was talking about. Restoration to social health requires an apology for mistakes made, requires a public expression of those apologies, and requires public forgiveness. And before you can go on as before. I mean, those are personal matters as well as social matters, but they have to occur for a society to go on. I mean, hatred that simmers is ridiculous, right? Well, yeah. But there's a lot of that, but there's a lot of it that's perfectly warranted.
Well, sure. Well, someone attacks you, obviously you're going to want to defend yourself.
So I don't want to downplay that. I think you don't want to keep your head in the sand. You don't want to admit that we haven't made ethical mistakes, and it hasn't all. What I was trying to say about the JCL, it hasn't always been on the side of the government. I think that a lot of the decisions of the JCL got taken in by the government. And I mean, there's probably mistakes on both sides. And I don't think the Japanese Americans are any holier than any other group. They're just as lousy as any other group that I've ever met. and I could name them if you want me to. But I suppose that they're probably useless to do that. I mean, there are heroes and saints on both sides, and there are devils and SOBs on both sides. So I don't want you to get the impression that just because you're studying a political historical mistake, that it dominates the terrain. I'd say some of the worst things happened in complicity with the leadership of certain Japanese Americans. And so I think that one ought to be perfectly candid about that. Tom can correct me if he wants to.
No,
He thinks
I'm
maybe
listening.
this is Tom Connell.
How are you?